Welcome back, everyone, to the Libertas International Podcast. I'm super pumped about today's episode, today's interview. I'll be interviewing Terri Markham. Terri Markham is the founder of a nonprofit called Uprising, Wyoming. Just Uprising. It's based in Wyoming, based out in Sheridan. And they're one of the only nonprofits doing anti-trafficking work in the state of Wyoming. And at Libertas, we are very open that we call Wyoming our home state. That's where our tax-exempt status is. And we ask a lot of questions. How can we protect our kids? What does human trafficking look like in Wyoming? And so I'm just super grateful that Terri would hop on to this interview, to be interviewed, to talk about her work and what she's doing to combat human trafficking in Wyoming. She's someone I deeply respect. Her nonprofit is doing some amazing work. And for those of us nonprofits who call Wyoming home for our tax-exempt status, this is such an insightful interview, and I'm excited to share it with you. And so, without further ado, enjoy this interview that I did with Terri Markham, the founder of Uprising, an anti-trafficking prevention organization in the state of Wyoming. Enjoy. Welcome, Terri, to the Libertas International Podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing pretty good. I got my coffee and I'm ready to chat about trafficking and exploitation.
Oh, such a good morning. Well, I'm super happy you came on. Obviously, we've been a big fan of you guys for a long time. You guys are the voice of human trafficking in Wyoming. Obviously, our mutual friend, Jen from Cowboy State Daily. I learned a lot about your work through her as well, and just some of the stuff that you've got going on. And so I guess to start, thanks for being on the podcast. I know that this will be an episode that's listened to quite often because so many people have questions about what trafficking looks like in our home state. And so let's start out to hear about you, how you got started, what's your story, how'd you end up in Wyoming, if you feel comfortable sharing where you live in Wyoming, and how did you make your way to what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to tell people I just sort of tripped into human trafficking work. It was definitely not like a career goal or anything. I feel like through most of my life, I was pretty oblivious of trafficking. It wasn't until about 12 years ago now. It's been a minute. I was sitting at church one day and a lady got up and started talking about an organization that she ran, and she was collecting scarves to take to women in strip clubs. And she was talking all about this ministry that she had. And I don't know why, but it piqued my interest. And I thought that was really bold. And so long story short, I ended up for about 4 years serving on this support group for women in the sex industry. So through that work, we would visit strip clubs and brothels, illicit massage parlors, and basically just kind of love on the women there, build rapport with them, let them know that they were cared and supported. And it was through that work that I think my eyes were first open to human trafficking. I began to, see things that didn't add up, hear things from the women that didn't add up. And it didn't take long to realize what was happening was trafficking and exploitation. And of course, like a lot of people in the US, the picture in my head did not match what I was seeing. I had the picture in my head that trafficking is, just something that happens in like these third world countries and stuff like that. So I immediately began to care. I'm not sure why. It was just put on my heart, and I went and I sought out lots of extra training on my own to learn everything I absolutely could about trafficking and exploitation. I kind of became the go-to trafficking person on our little group. So I would hang like posters and stuff in the clubs when we'd go and all of that so that the women had resources. And then eventually I stopped serving on that team and I started a chapter of a local anti-trafficking nonprofit in my hometown of San Antonio, Texas, which focused mostly on hotel and motels, which was an area that wasn't really being served at the time. And then that eventually just led to me doing this full time because I relocated to Wyoming about 6 years ago. I came here because I met my husband, who's a Wyoming boy. So that's what brought me up here. And when I got to Wyoming, I immediately started looking in like, where can I do anti-trafficking work? I want to plug in. I want to keep doing this work I care about. And I immediately found out like, well, there's not really anything. There's not really many people doing anti-trafficking work, not at least as their full-time jobs. And so Uprising was sort of born out of necessity. I initially just started kind of doing this work on my own. I was looking for another nonprofit I could volunteer through, perhaps. And then I met my co-founder. Her name's Alexandra. She's a survivor of trafficking. And it was really through Alexandra that I was encouraged to start a nonprofit. She promised to be by my side and help me through it. And so we did it together. And that's kind of how I ended up here.
That's awesome. Well, welcome to Wyoming. I'm glad that you are here and that you provide this amazing resource to Wyoming. I was kind of in the same boat, when I first got started too. I started looking for resources for survivors or people actively working, and the closest thing I could find was just stuff in Denver. There was nothing really in like the Wyoming area, and so I'm glad that by the time when I left to start Libertas in 2015, 2016, around there, that during that time that Uprising has been born and it's doing this amazing work. And just like with the story that you shared, I have two questions. One, it goes back to like your past, and you mentioned strip clubs. I encounter this a lot just in my conversations with people, where they talk about going to the strip clubs as something they do when they go to Salt Lake or go to Denver to go with the guys, or go in a business setting to go to the strip clubs. And you, when you went there, you encountered exploitation. And so I'd love you to just for people that have like that misconception of what strip clubs, what they think strip clubs are and what strip clubs really are. I'd love for you to like just speak into that, so people know when they go to a strip club, what kind of situations that they're encountering, what kind of industry they're supporting. And then give us the rundown of Uprising. Like, what do you guys do? What's your guys' mission? What is the essence of what Uprising is?
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you actually asked a lot more about the strip clubs, because obviously that's something I'm sort of passionate about, having spent so many years going to them, which is a weird thing to even say, but that was my life. There is data to suggest, and it's hard because we don't have a lot of comprehensive data in the anti-trafficking field. It's really hard to get a good, diverse study sample when it's such an underreported crime. But there is some data to suggest that people taking part in commercial sex in general, that a very high percentage of them, and I've seen anywhere between 85 and 95% of people taking part in commercial sex, are likely not there of their own free will. It's the force, fraud, coercion piece that actually keeps them there, or sometimes just plain survival. But it's not a job that they would probably pick just because, like, oh, this is a really great, fulfilling job. And this is what I feel called to do. The whole time for those 4 years that I was working in the clubs, and I would visit on average about 5 clubs monthly. That whole time that I was going into clubs, I think I encountered maybe one person who I truly felt like, okay, this person is here with their head down, just doing this work to put themselves through school. And I truly believed her. Everybody else there that I met clearly did not want to be there. Like, all of the women were constantly abusing alcohol and substances just to be able to survive that night of work, because it's not something that they wanted to do. They didn't like being subjected to the violence and all the other things that came. There were tons of the women who I know had pimps, and that's just another funding stream for them. They can sell them through online ads and stuff, but they can also make them go and work at the club to make some extra cash when they need to, or find new buyers, things like that. And then for the women who maybe weren't necessarily involved in trafficking, they were at extremely high risk to become involved with trafficking, because, again, the exploiters, the traffickers, they know that the women working in those clubs are extremely vulnerable. They're probably there because pure survival. They need to make money, and this is the only way they know that they can make the amount of money that they need to make. So they were kind of easy prey for an exploiter if they weren't already being exploited. So yeah, I think that's important to note, because when you frequent businesses like that, you are in fact like supporting exploitation. You're adding money into the pockets of a lot of these pimps. And that was actually like one of my first clues that something else was going on. Was a lot of the women had quotas that they needed to make by the end of the night, a certain amount of money they had to make before they could like cash out and leave. And then the very next day they'd come back and they were like, I need to make money. I don't have enough money to pay for my childcare, for this, for that. And I'd be like, well, what about the money that you just made? And they're like, well, that had to go to my boyfriend or something like that. And so that's where I started to see like things just aren't adding up. So even the money that they are making there is often not money that they get control of.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's such an important distinction of what exactly, like, it's not like I get so, and obviously those of us that are working in this industry know the amount of trauma that happens in those type of clubs, the type of life that so many of those girls have to that they go through to end up in a strip club. So for people to make jokes of like, well, I'm going to a business conference in Denver, so I'm going to do business and then hit the strip clubs in the evening, like honestly, it pisses me off because it's, we talk about,
Mm-hmm.
once again, it's wealthy men, it's privileged men that believe that because they have resources, they have access to the bodies of vulnerable women. And like you said, like trafficking can happen in these establishments, in these strip clubs, where strip clubs pay taxes, like to have a business license, yada yada yada. And so I appreciate you speaking into that.
Yeah. And I think it goes beyond strip clubs. I really lump any sort of commercial sex. So anywhere that people are trading money or anything of value in exchange for any type of sex act. So that could be, it's the strip clubs, but it's also pornography. It's also, online things like webcamming based services like the OnlyFans and all that kind of stuff. Like it's the same problem across the board with all of them. And it's just crazy how normalized it is. Because I mean, I feel like what it's doing is it's creating bridges for potential new sex buyers. It's creating bridges for exploiters to have even more access to vulnerable populations. And it's so normalized. Like I'll literally have, people I know, friends of mine, like they'll make jokes and things, on their social media, like, oh, gas prices are so high. I'm going to have to get on OnlyFans. And I'm like, don't do that. Like, don't add to the normalization of what this is. Let's call it what it is. This is commercial sex. It's not safe. It's not empowering. And a lot of times, all of those platforms, they're riddled with people who shouldn't be there as well. Minors are stripping in clubs. One of the survivors that I work very closely with in my organization, part of their story is that they were exploited through a strip club as a minor. My co-founder was exploited through a strip club, not as a minor, but as an adult. And so like it's totally happening. And I know you and I have talked about before about porn. That's like a whole nother thing we can get off on, but it's the same there. Just watching that content, I totally agree with a statement that you told me last time we spoke, that if there's something that you can do to help fight trafficking, one of the easiest things you can do is stop watching porn, because you're contributing to that every time you do that.
Yeah. Well, now tell me about Uprising. What does Uprising do? What's the
Yeah.
essence of it? What is your mission statement? What are your goals? Tell us about what the essence of Uprising is.
Yeah. So Uprising is really what we call an upstream organization. Whenever we founded it, we were really like, how can we attack the root of the issue and actually try to make a dent in human trafficking in Wyoming? And so a lot of our work is prevention based. We're trying to get ahead of the problem. It's also demand based. How can we reduce demand? Because honestly, we wouldn't have trafficking if we didn't have people who wanted to purchase commercial sex. And so everything that we do is kind of through that lens of how can I get even further upstream than this issue I'm staring at in the face, so that I can nip it in the bud before it even starts. And so that's really what we do. Our main areas of focus center around training and education. So we do an enormous amount of training with all kinds of populations of people across the state. So professionals, everything from like law enforcement, healthcare workers, service providers, victim advocates, financial institutions, hospitality industry, pretty much almost anyone I think could benefit from anti-trafficking training. So we do a tremendous amount of that through the state. We also do a lot of just community awareness. So we do a lot of events. We host a lot of like 101 presentations. We'll go speak to pretty much any group that's ever invited us. We find a way to make it work so that they can just learn a little bit more about what trafficking looks like in Wyoming, how to identify it, how to respond to it in your communities. And then prevention education is really the like cornerstone of what we were founded on. We knew that if we want to stop this problem, we need to reach younger and younger people earlier and more often, so that they don't unknowingly contribute to the problem, or they're a little more informed so that they can make safer decisions, so they don't become a victim of the problem. They're more informed so that they also, don't end up a future buyer, a future exploiter themselves. So we do just a tremendous amount of youth education. Everything that we've done, we look at it as building safety nets across communities and across our state. And the stronger those safety nets are, the fewer people that are going to fall through the nets. And so that's really the basis of what we did. When we started, we knew number one thing was youth prevention was our top priority, but we knew we also couldn't start with that because we had, especially me, I've had a lot of experience working with youth, so had my co-founder. And we knew that when you talk to youth, you tend to get disclosures about things that are happening. And at that point, we felt like we had a pretty unaware state. And so we attacked it sort of from the opposite direction. We started with professionals like healthcare workers, law enforcement, educators, people that youth might go to disclose, because we wanted them to be informed first, so that if a youth does disclose, they're not just shut down with like, trafficking doesn't happen here, So we started with that group, and then we went to community-based and tried to really build awareness across the state at a community level. And then we finally added in the youth. So it's really been now maybe a good 2 years of hitting it hard, working with youth directly. And we've trained over, last I checked, it was over 2,500 youth in the state. So I think we're doing a pretty good job chugging down our road. A really big goal for us, which sounds a little scary, is we would love statewide youth prevention. So every youth across the state has availability of prevention education for them. And it seems daunting, but then again, that's the great thing about doing this work in Wyoming. We're the least populated state. It's like 600,000 people in the whole state. It's not unreasonable to think that we could get education about trafficking like completely spread across the state, and almost all of our community members could be informed on some level.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know that when you think about like how many students that you've already trained, and you compare that to probably how many students that there are in Wyoming, like you've knocked out a good percentage of them. And so I like that. That's good. I mean, it definitely makes the task a little less daunting because we are the least populated state in the union. And I know that like you mentioned, the education, getting access to youth, training youth. I know a bunch of questions that I get all the time when I speak in Wyoming that, I reference a lot of like your stuff and point them to like the Cowboy State Daily articles there's an article that happened, I think maybe a couple years ago or a year and a half ago, of a girl from Salt Lake who met a guy online, and he was taking her to Seattle, and I think they were caught in Green River, Wyoming. If I'm getting the story correctly, I could be wrong on that. I'll attach the link to the real story in the show notes. But I probably would say it's safe to assume that that's not the norm. Like if parents from Wyoming are worried that their kid's going to get kidnapped in Greybull and taken to Denver, taken to Seattle, or taken to Salt Lake City, that's probably not the most likely scenario, I'm assuming. You can obviously correct me if I'm wrong. So I'd love to ask you, how is trafficking happening in Wyoming? Like, what are you seeing? What are the trends?
Mm-hmm.
And then like, where is it happening? Is there like a city where it's happening more often? Are you seeing it more in small towns? What is your experience in that of where it's happening and how it's happening in the state of Wyoming?
That's a great question. And I think that's my favorite thing to talk about, honestly, because I think if you understand what it actually looks like in your community, that goes a long way. Like, you'll be able to potentially identify it, potentially step in and help somebody. I think the thing that we see the most common, the number one disclosure of trafficking that we receive is familial based trafficking. And so that's when it's your family member who's trafficking you. So it could be a parent, it could be a grandparent, a spouse, an aunt, an uncle. What's scary about that type of trafficking is that in a rural community, like which pretty much all of Wyoming is rural or frontier based communities, that's a type of trafficking that can almost thrive because it's typically happening right out of your own home. And nobody's looking for that. We all have the picture of like the white van snatching the kid off the street corner. And so that's what we're all being cautious of. So if it's happening right in someone's home, it's easy to see how that could go undetected. And in our small communities, everybody knows everybody. So think how easy that could be for someone to know who they can safely sell to, who they can't sell to, so that they can go undetected. And then on top of all of that, reputations just go a long way in small communities as well. So if you have an outstanding reputation, even if a victim does speak out against you, what are the chances that they're going to be believed? And we've seen this happen. We had, there's a case I'll reference in Grable last year, which is a tiny little town over the mountain from where I'm at in Sheridan. And they were dealing with a city councilman who was exploiting children online. And whenever they arrested him and they interviewed like the other city council members, of course, the thing that everyone said was like, there's no way that he was doing this. Like, he's such a good guy. And that's the thing about exploiters. They're probably going to be good people. Like, they're going to have good standing in the community. They might be in positions of power even because they don't want people to know what's happening. They don't want you to think that they're an exploiter and this is what they're doing in the parts of their day that you don't see. So I think it's really important that people in Wyoming understand that a lot of times what we see is this is happening right in someone's home, because you've got to just be diligent. You've got to be trusting your gut, because it's probably, the kids who are sitting in our classroom, the person you passed at the grocery store, the lady sitting next to you in church, the boy who's on your Little League team. They're all among us. And one thing I do know really well from a lot of the survivors that we interact with is a lot of times while people are being exploited, they're still living regular lives as well. There's, that picture that everyone again has in their head that like these victims are locked in basements with chains around them. And that's absolutely not true. We rarely ever see that. Most of the time, they're still going to school, they're still going to work, they're still out in the community. They just have this whole other life that's happening. So that type of trafficking, it's everywhere. It's in all of our communities. I don't think there is one area of the state that we're seeing more trafficking in than any other type of area. It happens in the tiniest of towns and our larger cities. Now, of course, we probably have more cases we know about in like, Casper, Cheyenne, bigger areas that are more populated just because there's more people there. And we see different types of trafficking in those areas. Probably the type of trafficking that we have the most amount of that we've identified so far, I would say, would be online-based exploitation. We have an ICAC task force in our state, which is Internet Crimes Against Children. Every single state has one. Some states have multiple because of their size. We have one in Wyoming. It's comprised of 6 full-time staff members who work these cases, and their caseload is ridiculous. Last year in 2022, they had about almost 800 cyber tips that they investigated. They had about 27 child rescues, where it was a child who was being sexually abused in our state, and it was being filmed or videoed and sold online. And they were able to get that child out of that situation. And then they had multiple arrests of people who were abusing the children, consuming that content, producing it or distributing it. And so that one, just the sheer numbers of cases and prosecutions that we've had is pretty staggering for such a small state. So that's also one of the types of trafficking that we have the most data on, because we do have this whole task force who keeps track of what they're seeing. So that's probably the kind that I feel like we have the most number of cases of, but there's lots of other types of trafficking that I see in Wyoming too. Illicit massage parlor trafficking. So those are like Asian massage parlors that are offering services beyond what a massage parlor should. We have several cases and ongoing and active investigations of those across our state. We have as many as 16 suspected illicit massage parlors in our state right now. We also see things like gang control trafficking, which you wouldn't probably think of gangs in Wyoming. I certainly didn't. But the gang control trafficking is the number one disclosure I get from Native American partners that we're working with. And they're telling us that that's what they're seeing on the reservation here. So there's just all different kinds. It's so broad how trafficking can sort of present itself. So we just have to, you really just have to be diligent and get educated so that, again, you don't overlook something or you don't get that gut feeling and just write it off.
That's very helpful. You touched on a couple of different aspects of other questions I was going to ask about, like the reservation, for example. You mentioned sort of what you're hearing from there, and another point I wanted to touch on that you had mentioned is the ICAC and how busy they are, the work that they're doing. I know you had mentioned that you support them with care packages every quarter. Like, why do you do that? What is behind that, and what are your future goals with working with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force?
Yeah, I mean, wow, I just really love those guys. Ever since I learned about the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, I've just wanted to support them because, well, honestly, it's quite literally the worst job I could ever think of. I mean, these 6 individuals literally spend day in and day out looking and having to watch content of children being sexually abused. And I can't think of anything worse. And there's this stereotype about ICACs. I think a lot of people assume that maybe the bulk of their job is like working with teenagers who are sending nudes back and forth or something like that. But that's absolutely not true. The vast majority of the work that they do is the graphic and very violent sexual assaults of minors, mostly prepubescent minors, where that content is being filmed and videoed and put on the internet, and it's being sold and traded, and it's like a currency. And so I just feel like I have learned so much about what exploitation looks like from working alongside our ICAC. And that team of people is just so passionate. I mean, you have to be to continue to be able to do that work. And honestly, there's an expiration date on how long those individuals can last doing that work because it's not an easy job. So they will sometimes have turnover and have to get new people in. And so that's really the reason why we support them. They're also the only law enforcement agency in the state that really has good data on trafficking and exploitation, how much it's happening, how much we're seeing, how many arrests are being made. Their track record is incredible. Every time they launch a full-scale investigation, it typically, when they catch the person, it ends in them going away for a really, really long time. And so they're just doing incredible work. Their commander is also passionate about community education and youth prevention. So he will go into schools and talk to kids. Every time we've ever invited him to speak to a community, he takes us up on it and he comes and he'll present or co-present with me. We've also co-created resources for people in our state. And so, yeah, we started the care package program, I don't know, a year and a half or so ago, because I wanted this group of people who works on this really hard stuff to know that we see them and we care and we support them and we appreciate that they're helping keep our youth in Wyoming safer. And so a lot of people to this day, as much as I talk about ICAC, it never fails. Every time I give a community presentation, sometimes even a professional presentation, and I talk about ICAC, there's a lot of people who don't even know that's a thing that exists. And so it's a very unseen job of the closest thing I can think to a superhero. are these people. So yeah, we send them care packages of silly things, just to make their day a little brighter and let them know that we're thinking about them. And that's a really cool program. It's one of the highlights of my job that I get to do, actually. But I highly recommend. In Wyoming, our ICAT commander's name is Chris McDonald. They are housed under our Division of Criminal Investigation, DCI, and they try to do as much community-based awareness and presenting as they are able to take on. Obviously, they're very busy, but you can always reach out and request a presentation from them. And if they're able to, they always will try to accommodate it. Or you can reach out to Uprising, and we often will try to come and co-present together at things. So sometimes we can help with that too. It's very fascinating to learn about and to hear what some of those cases look like. And they're very good at also giving information to parents about online-based safety and the types of conversations and things you need to be having with your youth.
That's awesome. That's so great that you do that. I mean, I'm sure it just helps them feel so seen after just the world of darkness that they live in. You mentioned of like we see this a lot in Colombia as well, where like in Colombia, a lot of the street-based trafficking will be victims, maybe the average age 15, 14. The youngest one we've had on the street is 13, 12. I had an 11-year-old once, but it was only once that we saw something like that. Versus like the online stuff, it's a lot less risky for the pimps, for the traffickers, for the parents, for the uncles, whoever it is that's doing it. It's more violent, and the kids are significantly younger. I think our current stats at Libertas International are the average age of survivors that get referred to us that have been exploited exclusively online is around 8.5, I believe. And so that's where people really find just the young kids being abused. And that's why I'm with you. I can't imagine doing that job. I wouldn't want to do that job. And it's so awesome that you guys support them in that way, and that we have something like that in Wyoming that's actively looking to rescue those kids. You mentioned there was 27 rescues last year.
Yeah.
And then going after the bad guys as well that are participating in this, that are doing this in Wyoming and keeping our state just a little safer. A lot of our donors from Libertas International, because we got started in the Afton, Jackson Hole area, I know that they're going to ask if you've seen cases from there, if you know maybe what exploitation looks like in that area, in Cokeville, Jackson, Afton, Kemmer, the Lincoln County, Teton County area. Any thoughts on that, or what you're seeing, or what trafficking may look like in that area?
You know, it's an interesting area. Obviously, a lot of tourism in that area. And I think that that's an area where there's a lot of exploitation happening. I just spent some time in Jackson recently working with some of the law enforcement up there. And I can tell you that like it's definitely happening there. I was talking to someone who was telling me about the Uber drivers in Jackson Hole. They literally are telling us that like they'll pick up people from the airport sometimes who are like, hey, I have this much money to blow. Where can I go to have sex with someone? And like they're asking the Uber drivers this. I recently got a disclosure of a labor trafficking case out of Jackson Hole. And that's an area of the state that I'm really concerned with labor trafficking, because I know through the tourism industry, you know, hotels, motels, restaurants, bars, that's an area that has high prevalences of labor trafficking. And so I'm really concerned with labor trafficking in that area of the state. I think it's going to be something that's honestly, it's going to be hard to sort of pop the can of worms and see what's really happening. It's going to take a lot of push, because obviously we're going to have to walk a fine line of not disrupting tourism industry, because it's like a vital industry to our state, but also sort of setting expectations and standards that that's not something that we want to put up with in our state, that exploiting people is not right. I also think, you know, we have a lot of mega wealthy people who come into Jackson Hole. They have vacation homes there, they come on trips and things like that. Along with that, like you mentioned, sometimes comes this idea of like, I can purchase anything I want, including a person. So I worry about things like high-end escorts and stuff like that in that area of the state. But to this day, I feel like a lot of it is like my suspicions. The amount of actual cases that we have is smaller, but they're there. There's absolutely cases coming out of Jackson Hole, especially with the online-based stuff. We have cases of that in every single county. But like I said, I know for a fact that there's been labor cases. I know there's been sex cases in those areas of the state. And I think that there's probably way more than anyone is thinking. And thankfully, their law enforcement agencies in those areas seem really apt to learn and to want to do more and to want to dig in and launch these types of investigations. So it's our hope that we can continue working more in that area and sort of uncover what's there. But we do have great rapport, which is a really good start. One of our best law enforcement partners is based out of Jackson Hole. We have, lots of connections in that area. So it's just a matter of continuing to grow with our capacity and how much training and support we can provide.
So I guess my next question for you is I know some of the feedback I'll get from the podcast or questions. I think you probably get this all the time when you present. I get this all the time when I present is how can we protect our kids? How can we protect our families? How can moms protect their young? How can dads protect their daughters? So what advice you have for Wyoming families specifically on how to keep your kids safe from being victims of human trafficking and exploitation?
I think the number one thing, and it seems easy and cheesy perhaps, but is just being a safe adult with open lines of communication. Talk to your kids. All the time I encounter parents, and I understand being a parent myself, that it is terrifying. But we have to just be open with our kids. We have to give them the information. They need to know the dangers and the harms that are out there. And so we have to be real with them to a certain extent. And it sucks because I do believe that we have to start having some of the harder conversations, perhaps a little earlier than what makes us comfortable. But that's just the reality because our kids have access to so much in media and with technology. It's like you can't wait till they're 12 or 13 and hitting puberty to have some of these key conversations about, sex and our bodies and consent anymore. We need to be doing those earlier and more often. And really, I think the best thing is just making sure these conversations aren't like a one and done. They're ongoing with your kids. And so my daughters, I have 3 daughters. So it's a bit terrifying. They're now ages 11, 12, and 14 years old. And they've been sort of my guinea pigs. But I, from very young ages, I was constantly having conversations with them. When they were little, bath time used to be our time to have tough conversations. We would talk about the anatomy of their body so they knew all the right terms for their body. And I would safety plan with them. So I would throw out things like, hey, if you're ever at school and you go to put your coat away in the coat closet and your teacher comes up behind you and they touch your butt, what would you do? And so I would just like run through scenarios and help my kids think of every possibility of anything I could think of that could happen to them. As they've gotten older, we've had to morph into, of course, having conversations surrounding sex and exploitation and online. You have to talk to them about the dangers that are out there online. Even if you're the parent who's like, well, my kid's not getting a phone until they're this age. The facts are that these elementary kids, when we go into elementary age classrooms and we ask them who has a phone or a device of some kind, it's like over 90% of the kids raise their hands. So even if you're the parent who doesn't let your kid have that, chances are their friends probably have that, and therefore they might have access that way. So it's really just talking about stuff. The key topics that I always tell parents to talk about are consent, healthy relationships, healthy boundaries, talk about what coercion means, and that's like the blackmailing, the peer pressure, the threats, so that they really have a good compass for if anything like that ever happens to them, it's going to send a warning bell to their head and their red flags are going to be going off. And the online based stuff, it's hard. It's just hard to stay ahead of that. But I'm a firm believer in whatever apps or games that your kid has, you should have those too, because you need to know them. You need to know how they work. I'm also a fan of playing dumb with my kids. So when they have, whatever app on their phone, if you really want to learn more about it, just play the role of the technology impaired parent. Like, hey, I really want to learn about how to use this Snapchat. Can you open up your app, show me around, teach me all about it? And that gives you like a tour of their device. And you get to ask questions and they feel like empowered because they're getting to show you about it. So yeah, it's a lot of little things. There's no like one secret thing. The biggest thing is just communication, constant communication. My kid now feels very safe coming to me with stuff. She's come to me with, hey, I'm worried about my friend. They're doing this online and it seems dangerous. And she feels open to come to me about it because she knows that I'll be real with her and I'll help her no matter what. And if she ever did make a poor decision, she knows that I wouldn't be mad at her or angry at her, that I would just want to help her no matter what situation she found herself in.
Yeah. You touch on so many important things. I think I give the same advice, specific like the cell phones and social media and stuff. Like it's really not necessary for like kids now to go out and um go like a 13-year-old going out in the street or hanging out late at night or going into a club or whatever, like that they can gain access to the same type of stuff just via their cell phones with an internet connection.
Mm-hmm.
And then we always tell parents of like be
Yeah.
aware who your parent or who your kids are talking to
Yep.
um online, because I mean kids are wanting to increase their follower numbers to compete
Yep.
with friends, to compete online, to be influencers, whatever. And not all of those people following these kids are good people. Like we've had lots of cases, even like around the world in Latin America, even here in the States, where um, survivors met the trafficker via Instagram or Snapchat or Grinder, like any of these different kinds of
Oh my
apps.
gosh, yeah. It's all the time it's happening. You have to be involved in their online life. Like this is great. One of my friends, who's a survivor actually, so she's obviously tries to be very diligent with her own kids. She said it best. She's like, you know what? When it comes to my kids, like their privacy, their space, like their rooms, their personal space, their bodies, their personal space, absolutely they have a right to privacy. But in our house, the rule is when it comes to technology, nobody has a right to privacy because it's just not safe. And I mean, think about it. Like, you would never. I'm trying to think. Like the biggest event we have in Wyoming, Cheyenne Frontier Days. Could you ever fathom just taking your child and dropping them off alone at Cheyenne Frontier Days? Like that seems crazy. It's like it's full of strangers. There's dangers. There's people there. There could be predators. You would never just drop them off, at least not without like a lot of directions and talking and coaching and things like that, and safety measures that you would put into place for that. It's the same thing online. When they hop on that app, they literally have access to sometimes thousands or millions of people all over the world. So why would you ever just let them drop in on that? Yep. You have to stay involved with what they're doing, and you have to be having tough conversations with them so that they have all the tools possible to try to navigate those spaces and make the best, healthiest decisions that they can. And you have to know that they're probably still going to mess up sometimes because they're kids with underdeveloped brains. So you have to leave the door open of, if something ever does happen, you can come to me and you're not going to be in trouble. I'm not going to be mad at you. I'm only going to want to help you.
Yep.
That way that they have that safe place to land. It's just so important.
You mentioned something maybe like 5 minutes ago about the scenario that you run through with your kids with the teacher, and I think that's such an important point to touch on. Is I would say to parents, you don't need to be so worried about like the stuff you see on Facebook about like the white van parked out at Target. Mm-hmm. Like there may be like a creepy guy in there, but the statistics state that it's not likely your kids are going to get mm-hmm. trafficked by a guy in a van at Target or Costco or whatever. more likely than not, it's going to be someone like a teacher, a pastor, a bishop, an uncle, an aunt. It's going to be the people that are closest to your kids, that have access to their trust, access to the parents' trust. So, I mean, I don't want to say be wary of everybody, but be wary of everybody, and having that line of communication open to where it's like, hey, Mrs. Whoever or Mr. Whoever wanted me to come over tonight and come watch a movie or whatever, that there's this open conversation of like this, even though this person is in a place of trust, it's weird because me and my parents have talked about this and I don't feel comfortable and I want to verbalize it, and creating a safe space to where your kid can verbalize that to where they don't feel like they're going to get in trouble, I think is such an important point that you touched on.
I 100% agree with you. It is almost always someone that they already know, love, and trust, or someone who is working really hard to develop a relationship with your kid. Like in the case of like someone they meet online, they're going to be working real hard to make them think they're their boyfriend or their girlfriend or whatever. It's not like stranger danger. It's not the snatching kids off corners. And I think the running through scenarios, I call that safety planning. Because again, they're little underdeveloped brains. The last piece of their brain that really comes into full development is the frontal lobe, where all their like decision making happens. So kids are poor decision makers. Like that's just the facts. And practice makes permanent. So when you run through scenarios like that on a regular basis, you're making them think critically about all the possible outcomes of a potential scenario that could happen. And that makes it so that if they ever get into a situation that's similar, their brain automatically is going to know where to go. It's already made these connections. It's already made these pathways to know, okay, here's my options and things that I could do to safely navigate the situation I find myself in. And for me, safety planning, no one was off the table. I'm talking about, what if it was your teacher? What if it was your grandpa? What if it's your dad? Like no one is safe from my safety planning, because I've seen just too many situations. And sometimes it is like the random scary thing. There's like growing sextortion crimes right now where kids are meeting people online. They're being coerced into sending nude photos or videos. And then the second that exploiter has that content, they're threatening them that they're going to release those photos and videos if they don't send them money or if they don't send them continued sexual content. We just had a sextortion case this past year. The disclosure came out of Laramie High School from a 14-year-old female, and turns out she was being sextorted. As ICAC started launching their investigation, they quickly found that this case was connected to many others. And turns out this exploiter had like something like 900 victims across the US. I believe it was like 24-ish of those were here in Wyoming that they found. And the exploiter was in Malaysia. And you would kind of think that might be where that investigation ends. But it's pretty incredible, some of the investigative tools and connections that they have now. So they were able to work with like our FBI and Malaysian government, and it resulted in this person getting arrested, and now he's awaiting trial. So you just never know. You like have the conversation with your kid, make sure that they know there's safe avenues to report, and then there actually is help out there. Sometimes we actually can catch these bad guys, even if it is the person in a foreign country, or if it is, your neighbor or grandpa down the street or the teacher. So
as coming to an end on this podcast, we've talked a lot about Wyoming and the stuff that you do, the cases that you see in Wyoming. So two things I want to touch on is one, when a victim, when a survivor wants help in Wyoming, what kind of services are there? What is the state lacking? What needs to change there? And Shared Hope, that nonprofit, they kick out their state rankings every single year, the report cards, and Wyoming is always like a consistent C, maybe a D. And so in your experience, like, is that accurate? And what can Wyoming do to, I guess, get to the next level as far as like the prevention, the prosecution, the rescue, the aftercare? What can Wyoming do to help elevate its status to where people don't see Wyoming as far as like protecting survivors, going after criminals, as somewhere where it's average at best, but to where it's exceptional, it becomes a model to follow. Like, what do you see? What can Wyoming improve on basically to help elevate our status as someone that protects kids and goes after bad guys? What needs to happen?
Yeah. Oh man, that's like a lot of questions in one.
I
So
know.
you might have to remind me of them, but let me start with saying, so Wyoming was actually the last state in the US to even enact any human trafficking statutes. We were dead last. Our human trafficking laws came on the books in 2013, which is seems like yesterday, not that long ago. The good thing about being last is we saw what everybody else did first. So legislatively, we're not in a bad place because we were able to say, like, ooh, they're doing this good, they're doing this good, this is what we want to do. So our legislation is pretty solid. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement, and we're learning that as we go. And so there's things that we're fighting for legislatively, but we're not in a horrible place. Now, when it comes to those state report cards, I've learned a lot about the state report cards. They're a great tool. I love to be able to show people, like, look how low our grade is, and use that to enact action in people. But what I also know about the state report cards is they're very narrow with their view on human trafficking and protecting of children. So they're looking just at your trafficking specific statutes that are on the books. We have a lot of other statutes that maybe aren't human trafficking per se, but would come into play in a human trafficking situation that would help to safeguard youth in our state. And they just won't even look at those. So, when they come every year and they go to the executive director of the Division of Victim Services and they want to discuss our laws and our legislation so that they can grade us, we often give them tons of information, and they take a very little part of it. And so I will say that information, it's almost like skewed. The other thing about the grading scale is we had a higher grade across the US. People had higher grades. There were lots of states that had A's and B's. I think the highest we ever got up to was a C. And then about a year and a half or so ago, they skipped a year of doing the grades because they decided we had all reached like a standard, and they now wanted to redo the standard. And so they redid all the matrices and all the things that they were looking at for these grades. And when they did that, it bumped everybody in the whole entire country back down. So now the highest grades in the country that you'll find are like C's and D's. But there's a lot of people who have like D's and F's and things now because they wanted a full reset to make everybody work again to improve, which makes sense. I get why they did it. But also for especially a lot of states who had worked their way up to a really high grade, now they're bumped down to a low grade again. They're like, what the heck? We spent all this time doing this. So you just have to know, like everything else, you really have to know and understand what you're looking at for the data as far as those grades are concerned. What I think we really need, first of all, we have no human trafficking victim services that are specific human trafficking related services in the state of Wyoming. We do have domestic violence sexual assault programs in every single county in Wyoming, and they will serve a victim of trafficking. But doing aftercare, that the protocol that you would follow with a trafficking victim is often vastly different than that of a domestic violence sexual assault victim, even though there are similarities in them being like, sexual crimes against people. So oftentimes the programs that we have don't have the robust type of services that a trafficking victim would need to truly be able to heal and go on to live, a fulfilling, productive life. So oftentimes, unfortunately, those people might fall through the cracks. They might just go back into exploitation because they don't have an easy out that gives them the services they need. And Uprising, even though we're not a victim serving agency, we have been getting a lot of calls. We get on average right now 2 to 4 calls a month, probably, from either law enforcement agencies, victim serving agencies, or victims themselves who are looking for help of where they can go for trafficking specific long-term care. And so we do a lot of scrambling around of trying to find who in the US has open beds that fit this specific survivor's needs. So it's almost like case management, even though that's not really our job. So my hope is we're trying to develop relationships with, new task forces that are popping up and new organizations that we're meeting who, have those connections better. And we hope that we can find a solution in our state before that gets overwhelming.
Yeah.
So that we can find safe ways and places for those victims to go. But right now, as it stands, it's probably not in Wyoming, unfortunately. And a lot of times, where someone is victimized, a lot of times with this type of crime, it's easier for those survivors to go somewhere else to heal. So, it'd be great if eventually we get some victim services in our state. And I do know I've met people in our state who are very passionate and would love to open like a safe house for survivors here in Wyoming. I think it's still a long ways off, but I think it's something that will be part of our future one day. And that'll be great because some of the beds could be for Wyoming people, but maybe some are for out of state people who need to come here and heal. And then we could send our people to another state for them to go there and heal,
Yeah.
And so it could almost be like a great bargaining chip. Like we can help you and you can help us. But right now it's always a scramble. Every single time that I get a victim and they need a place to go, it's always a scramble of trying to find where they can go, and finding vetted organizations that do aftercare can be really difficult because sometimes we send people somewhere and then months later we find out that there's been lots of allegations against the care that those places are providing. So it's really hard to know who's a safe place to send someone to, who's not a safe place. We've had people who were providing care in our state who were like housing victims in their home, which is not safe. And they had no oversight and things like that. So I think it's a big problem. And that's an area that our state's going to be forced to reckon with at some point, because at some point we're going to, as we continue to do more education and awareness, there's going to become more and more disclosures. People are going to feel safe to reach out for help here, and we're not going to have that next piece. So eventually we're going to have to get that next piece.
Yeah, and I think the education part is so important. Like we got a case. We'll release the story on the podcast here on its launch next week. But it's a project we called Project Frankenstein, where this guy, his legal name was Frankenstein. That's why the case is called that way. But he was abusing his niece who lived in his home. And when the videos were discovered online and she was taken to her forensic interview, she didn't recognize that she was a victim of trafficking because it happened so often, like in her childhood, to where she just thought this was a normal way to grow up. And her definition of trafficking was maybe something that you'd see maybe like on CNN or the news, where you're taken to Thailand or Russia and trafficked in another country, to where she wouldn't disclose because she didn't think it was happening to her. And so with your education program specifically of educating youth and empowering youth to have the words to describe like what's happening to them, and maybe something that's happening to them isn't right, is against the law, they're a victim of a crime, when many of them may not realize that, there will be more reports, there will be more needs of victim services, there will be more need for foster parents in the state. And so it's almost like you described like this collision that's coming with like more education is going to mean a demand for resources, and our state legislature, our state leadership is going to have to reconcile with that, where we can't stop sending Wyoming kids to Denver, to LA, to Seattle, to wherever. Like we're going to have a resource here in Wyoming as well.
I agree.
So it's an
that
interesting
day is coming. That's why I'm trying to sound the alarm now. I'm already seeing the uptick. I'm already seeing the need. We have to get this under control now because it's going to be unmanageable when we hit that point. So, but it's so hard in a state like Wyoming where there's not a lot of official human trafficking cases on the books. It's hard to make the case that this is something that we need.
Yeah, and I will say, like with Wyoming too, like Wyoming, I really think it's the best state in the union. I love Wyoming, but a lot of the info that they have does come from specific news sources that maybe aren't the most educated on what human trafficking looks like. And so leadership, I've even had meetings with like leadership where I'll describe a case to them of human trafficking that I see in Colombia, and they're kind of like, well, were they brought back to the States, or like how did it happen? And it's like, no, she was just trafficked, inside her home by her uncle, by a family member, and it all happened online. And having to like rework their framework to where they get a real education on what human trafficking looks like. And I think the responsibility is going to have to be on the leadership to get real human trafficking education that doesn't come through the lens of a certain news station or politics or whoever, that they listen to survivors,
Mm-hmm.
they listen to people that have real world experience, and they listen to experts like yourself that are not gaining your education through a political lens on the news, but from survivors themselves. And I think that day is rapidly coming, and I hope that our leadership is prepared to listen to those that have real life experience, because I think that's how you're going to make the most trauma sensitive victim service support in the state.
Yep. I 100% agree.
Oh, good.
Totally agree with that. And there's
That's
more
good.
people every day joining the cause, joining the fight, so to speak. There's new agencies popping up. So I just like go on faith that, someday someone's going to pick up the call and want to meet the need of victim services in our state for trafficking victims. Hopefully it's not going to be me. I don't want it to be me, but I fully support them when they do come along.
Well, Terri, my last question for you is, how do people get a hold of you, and how do people help Uprising? Like, people that listen to this conversation are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that something like this exists. How do I bring them to my city? How do I support them? What are some of the needs that Uprising has right now, and how do people gain access to the resources that you're offering?
Yeah. Well, the best way to keep up with what we're up to, visit our website, uprisingwyo.org. You can see all of the upcoming events. You can read all about us. We have a lot of resources on there. And then social media, of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, all the things, almost everything. Our hashtag or our name would be Uprising YO. So we're pretty easy to find, and we're constantly doing stuff around the state. The thing that we need most is donations, time and money. We have a statewide volunteer program that we're really trying to build up, because we are a staff of 3 covering the entire state and beyond. A lot of our training and stuff that's beyond the Wyoming borders. So we almost call ourselves more regional serving than state serving at this point. But it takes a lot of people to do that. I can train someone to do community-based awareness or to help with prevention education so that I can handle, bigger fish, like the large scale professional trainings that we do. So we just need more people who are passionate, who want to do that. So you can see all about our volunteer opportunities on our website, and of course we have fun things, like the care packages and stuff, where like, if you just want a one and done help with something, we'll always find a place for that too. And then of course, funds. The great thing about our organization being prevention and education based is that prevention and education is pretty cheap. It's usually me standing in front of people, training them, talking to them. It's conversations. So our biggest expense is honestly, it's staff salaries and travel around the state, because we're constantly moving around the state. But it's really cheap. The bad thing about prevention and education is that a lot of the grant funding that's out there for human trafficking is all for working on the problem after it's happened, not before it's happened. So we don't qualify for 99.9% of the human trafficking grants that are out there. So almost all of our operation is run off of grants from private local foundations here in Wyoming and private donors and boots on the ground fundraising, which is great, because that also offers us the freedom to do what we need to do. So, I always tell people $5 goes a long way in an organization like ours. So don't ever be intimidated by, if I can't write a big check, I'm not going to write a check at all, because every dollar really helps.
For sure. That's what we tell people at Libertas as well, where we're big on like the monthly donor program, where people donate 20 bucks a month, 50 bucks a month, whatever, $5 a month, whatever they can support. And for us, as mainly a victim service agency, it just helps us to plan in the future to where, like, our thing is, when a survivor is vulnerable enough to ask for help and disclose the most intimate thing that's ever happened to her, the most horrific thing that's ever happened to her or him, we have a few boys, that they have a safe place to land, where there's care, there's love, there's safety, there's support, and there's resources to help. And that only happens because of monthly donations. So we're big as well. Even like $5, it goes a
Yeah.
long way. And so I'm glad I'll add the I'll add your website in the show notes where people can find you. A few of the cases we've talked about, but Terri, I just want to thank you for being on the podcast and for your support and all the work that you're doing. I'm so looking forward to spending a weekend in Sheridan at your event at the end of this year. I'll push all of our supporters to go follow you guys on Facebook, on Instagram, on social media, and just thank you for the work that you're doing. It's been such an honor to talk with you. And is there anything else you'd like to say or that I didn't mention before we close the podcast?
No, thank you. I echo all of that back to you, right back at you.
Thanks, Terri. Awesome. Well, I will push that out. I'll let you know when it comes out. And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.